It's my great pleasure to present today a talk of Chloé Berthélémy, who is a senior advisor at European Digital Rights, an association of civil and human rights organizations in Europe. She's responsible for the policy work on law enforcement, migration, and data protection at European Digital Rights. And today she's going to present interesting insights on the EU's growing role in restricting encryption more and more. So you have the stage, Chloé.
Thank you so much. I hope everybody can hear me well. Thank you so much for the invitation and the nice introduction. Sorry I cannot be with you today. It would have been a pleasure, but this is what it is. As Sven introduced me, yes, I work at European Digital Rights. I want to say a few more words about our organization. We are a network association, which means that we represent national organizations, NGOs, working at local and national levels. And our mission is really much to make sure that European legislation is respecting fundamental rights in the digital era, which means that we try to influence EU laws. We talk to the different EU institutions, and we try to make sure that they understand what technology is about and how certain policies may impact people's rights and liberties online, but also offline via the use of technologies. And so today I wanted to give you a brief overview of the EU's role in the so-called crypto wars. So all the attacks organized and led by states, and how this is a growing role that has been going on for several years. This is not meant to be exhaustive, but it will give you a brief overview of how the EU is using its policies, some practices, informal practices, and its wider political agenda in that context. So how are we going to go about this? Very simply, I'm going to talk about some of the EU policies that matter for the topic of encryption. Then I'm going to lay out a little bit the law enforcement advocacy strategy that has been going on for some years now in the EU, at least more than 10 years, and how they use certain police cooperation operations called SkyCC and EncryChat to further their narrative against encryption, to legitimize attacks against encryption. And then I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about what is coming up in this current mandate. So we had elections, European elections, last year in 2024, and the legislative term is ending in 2029. And so the Commission, the European Commission has laid out a certain strategy, and some of it relate to encryption. And so we will see how this strategy may include elements that would undermine encryption. So let's start with a little bit of overview of EU policies. I think it's a reminder for maybe most of you, but it's good to have it in mind. The EU has quite a good acquis. We call it acquis. So it's like a set of laws that it adopted over the years, and that constitute a legal framework to ensure cybersecurity and data protection in the EU. So in all the 27 member states. Now, this is, again, not exhaustive, but the main instruments I wanted to highlight here are the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, very important, you probably heard of it, which introduced some requirements for data entities that process data, data controllers, data processors, to ensure data protection by design and by default. And that includes also making sure that they have sufficient levels of security when they do such processing. And that's for personal data, obviously. And the second one I want to highlight is the NIS directive, which is a Network Information Security Directive. There was a first version, and then now we are at the second, which was adopted in 2022. And it's introduced some obligation of security guarantees for entities in critical sectors, specifically electricity grids, for example, water supply, and so on and so forth. So more like kind of infrastructures that are critical for society to function. And there's obviously a lot of incentive in this text to use state-of-the-art encryption. So also very positive. The directive lays out that there shouldn't be any attempt to weaken end-to-end encryption. That is essential to protect such critical technology and to provide some effective protection of data and privacy, as well as security of communications. We also have an e-privacy directive. This is an old instrument from 2002. So it starts to be a bit old, and there were some attempts to revise it in the past 25 years, which were more or less successful. I'm not going to go into the detail, but it lays out, again, very crucial fundamental principles for the protection of electronic communications. Notably, it forces electronic communication service providers, such as telecom, but also interpersonal communication providers, so messenger, email services, to take appropriate technical and organizational measures to safeguard security of their service. Again, quite essential. And then lastly, the last one is the Cyber Resilience Act, which was the last instrument to be adopted in 2024, so just last year. And again, here you have a series of essential security requirements that digital products put on the market in the EU have to fulfill. And for example, you cannot put a product on the market that has known exploitable vulnerability. You should ensure that there is sufficient protection from unauthorized access. And it encourages the protection of confidentiality of communications online via encryption. So again, as you can see, a legal framework that centers encryption as an essential tool to achieve digital security for all type of users, either individual users through the GDPR to the industry in the critical sector, but also more generally also any kind of digital service or product. Now, the problem is that there's also a constant tension related to encryption, which is not new, but already started when encryption started to be a little bit more of a mainstream use. And it is especially like acute. This tension is acute post-Snowden era. We have the EU who is facing kind of two different interests. One is, again, from what I said before, encouraging the use of encryption, the development of strong encryption systems, as they call it, ensuring a higher level of cybersecurity and protection of personal data. They acknowledge it in their strategy. But also, the EU is also perceiving encryption as a major threat to the detection, investigation, and prosecution of crimes. That's because law enforcement authorities are complaining that because of encryption, they no longer have access to essential data or evidence for the purpose of prosecuting crime. And therefore, we end up with this very conflicting views. For example, in a council resolution of 2020, which was pitched as security through encryption, security despite encryption. And what it means is basically, yes, we want the continued use of strong encryption technology, but we also want to guarantee the powers of law enforcement and the judiciary. They say to operate on the same terms as in the offline world, but what it means is basically to have access to encrypted data whenever they need. And that comes to the very problematic, unsolvable puzzle of having the cake and eating it too, so to say. So having strong encryption, but also being able to decrypt when necessary. And this is where the problem starts. Now, the EU has been trying to solve this issue for a very long time by at least since 2015, trying to run some expert groups, discussion between member states, between civil society, technologists, academia, and so on. But the far-reaching measure it went to was a legislative proposal that some of you may know in the context of the fight against child sexual abuse material online. And so the Commission decided to address this issue of encryption in this framework, in this context, which obviously is a very problematic issue. Like the abuse of children is obviously a very big societal problem. But to be honest, we also understood it as a pretext to push for an anti-encryption agenda. And so the legislative proposal was proposed in May 2022 by the Commission. And since then, it has been blocked at the Council level, which means that member states have not been able to find a compromise on the text. And so for now, it's not adopted, it's still negotiated, but they failed to find a solution, again, because of this encryption problem. So what the proposal contained or included was the possibility for member states' competent authorities, so law enforcement most of the time, to issue detection orders to online communication services, which encompass a lot of them, messengers, internet access providers, social media platforms, file sharing providers, and so on and so forth. And those detection orders would force them to scan for evidence of known but also unknown abuse material, plus grooming, which is the practice of an adult trying to manipulate or incentivize a child to carry out certain sexual acts. And they would be forced to report any of this material or this text to the police. Now, what it means in practice and for online communication services and for those especially that offer encrypted communication services, is to either disable end-to-end encryption, so they just stop providing encrypted communication services altogether, or they use kind of a technology that has been coined as client-side scanning, CSS, to scan every online message before it is sent. So the analysis of the text, the audio, or the image is done on the device of the user directly before it is then encrypted and sent. Now, obviously, it raised a lot of problem in terms of fundamental rights, but also in terms of cybersecurity. We argued, obviously, with a lot of other civil society organizations and technologists that this is a warrantless mass surveillance. It means that all users' private communications are being scanned and monitored without individualized suspicion, which is a core principle in EU criminal justice and a core principle of a democratic system. Everybody is treated by default as a suspect and is monitored until proven sort of innocent. It also undermines, obviously, IT security and encryption. As I said, even clients and scanning was analyzed by technologists, and it was found that it led to a lot of introduction of vulnerabilities in the systems. And then also there was obviously a risk that those type of scanning technologies would rely on certain algorithms that are not perfect and perfectly accurate. And this would lead to huge volumes, potentially, of lawful and legitimate material to be caught in the net and people being wrongfully reported to the police, which happened already. We had cases of certain scanning technologies, notably by Google, to report people who sent nudes or pictures of children naked at the beach. Another related piece of legislation that the EU has adopted, which is relevant to this topic, is called the interim derogation. Now I'm going a little bit more technical into the legal aspects, but it's quite important. The reason why we have the CSA regulation is because they are attempting to find a long-term solution to the access to encrypted data for the purpose of detecting child sexual abuse online. Before that, before the CSA regulation, the situation was that companies, and especially the big tech ones, the dominant ones, would do voluntary scanning, which means they would decide by themselves to take some measures and scan the private communication of their users. The problem is that the EU adopted in 2018 the European Electronic Communications Code, and that code actually extended the rules for the protection of privacy to OTTs, over-the-top services, which means that services like Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, and so on and so forth fold suddenly into the e-privacy directive scope. And therefore, they would have to stop doing voluntary scanning of their users' communication. Now, I'm talking about communications that are not encrypted, end-to-end encrypted, obviously, in that context. And that raised a lot of problems among the law enforcement community because they relied a lot on this voluntary scanning to have cases of child sexual abuse material reported to them. And therefore, they asked for a derogation. Yes, the scope is extended, the rules apply to those new messaging services, but we want an exception. And this is what the lawmakers gave them. They allow to derogate from the privacy protection afforded by the e-privacy directive and allowed voluntary detection of text, image, videos, again, by those communication services if they wanted to. Now, again, I said it's a temporary solution. It's supposed to be replaced by the CSA regulation, which is a long-term, it's supposed to be enforced and kept for a long term. So it was adopted, the interim derogation was adopted in 2021 and was supposed to end in December 2022. But the CSA regulation was blocked politically, which means that after December 2022, Facebook and Meta would have to stop doing their voluntary detection. And again, it triggered some panic. So they extended it again and again in 2024 as well. The next deadline now is April 2026, and they hope to have adopted the CSA regulation before that. I want to highlight that theoretically in this interim derogation, end-to-end encryption is theoretically out of scope. That's in the recital part of the legislation, which means it's not necessarily non-binding, but it means that it should be protected in principle. And the technologies that those companies use voluntarily to detect CSAM supposedly are supposed to follow certain requirements. They have to be state-of-the-art in the industry, and they have to be the least privacy intrusive. They're also under Data Protection Authority supervision. Now, it doesn't mean that they are not also generalized scanning methods, which is very problematic. And if brought to court, we argue as privacy advocates that it might not be rubber stamped by the court or accepted by the court. Another point I wanted to highlight when I mention EU policies is first, yes, the EU is taking certain legislative or putting forward legislative proposal to solve this encryption issue, but they also in certain other areas, they're doing nothing. And doing nothing is not politically neutral. And so I want to talk to you briefly about the spyware problem and the fact that the EU is not taking any action. So as you may be aware, there has been repeated scandals in the EU related to the use by many member states, Poland, Hungary, Greece, Spain, Italy, and so on and so forth, of commercial spyware. So it's a very intrusive hacking technique, which circumvent encryption against journalists, human rights defender, political opponent, dissidents, and activists, etc. This raised a lot of criticism, obviously, and gave rise to a lot of debate. And it's also problematic because it's never seen before intrusion capabilities. We are really talking about sophisticated hacking tools, which have a very big, large power of data extraction. They can impersonate the user. They can take remote control of all the functionalities on the device, activating the mic, activating the camera, etc. And for that reason, I think it's very important to highlight in the context of encryption, because when you're targeted by spyware, even if you're using the most advanced encryption tools, you might not resist this type of attacks. It also represents a cat and mouse game between commercial spyware vendors and the kind of legitimate internet service providers, developers, manufacturers of device. And the problem is that this cat and mouse game is not regulated or barely regulated at all. So one party, the commercial spyware vendors, are trying as much as possible to find vulnerabilities in systems and also develop exploits, while the other side is trying to patch as quickly as possible all those vulnerabilities and solve and fill the gaps, basically, in their security system. And the problem is that the EU is permitting this. There is a certain permissiveness of this game, but the impact is obviously on the users. There are many privacy violations at stake, and privacy is obviously an enabler of the exercise of all other fundamental rights: the right to speak online, to self-organize, to assembly, the right to access certain information, and so on and so forth. And so when journalists, lawyers, etc., are under attack, also democratic processes and values are at stake. And lastly, obviously, with unpatched vulnerabilities and the fact that they are actively thought for offensive purposes and sold on the market, our collective security is also at risk because it undermines the security of our infrastructures. I referred to the EU permissiveness. It is true. It happens to be that the EU has become sort of a safe haven for commercial spyware vendors to come and establish themselves on the territory of certain member states and sell their products on the global market, which means that there is not enough kind of regulation as to the establishment of those companies, but also on the trade of their product, which are very dangerous. And so you've got some reporting in the press that says that Israeli hackers, which are the most well-known worldwide to develop the most sophisticated tools currently, or, for example, re-establishing themselves in Spain, for example, but also Italy is a very flourishing market, which provided a lot of those tools worldwide. And we think that the EU single market is very regulated, but for those type of product, not at all. What's the political situation on spyware? I said there is an absence of reaction, and that's true. The European Parliament has done some work following the scandals related to the Pegasus spyware. They adopted some recommendations for EU actions, both legislative and non-legislative, related to regulating the use of spyware, regulating the exploitation of vulnerabilities, and so on. This was released in June 2023, and those recommendations were addressed to the Commission, to member states, to the Council, to a series of actors. Obviously, none of them were followed up, and so far it's just nice on paper, but it's not implemented. There was a resolution acknowledging the lack of legislative follow-up by the Commission in November 2023, but since then there is nothing that happened. The European Commission promised a communication, which is a non-legislative initiative, which is non-binding. It's just a nice paper that is supposed to recall the EU acquis, so the EU legal framework, in the area of data protection and privacy. And why does that mean for the use of spyware? And notably, they were supposed to clarify the interplay between EU law and national security. National security is a prerogative of member states. And theoretically, EU law doesn't apply when member states are acting within that context of protecting national security. And this has been kind of the crux of the debate at EU level, because member states have been hiding behind this pretext of national security and saying, no, EU law in terms of data protection and privacy doesn't apply because we've used spyware for the sake of protecting our national security. So please leave us alone. Don't come scrutinizing our action in this area. And so the communication was supposed to be a response to this debate about when does EU law apply? When can victims argue that they are protected by EU law, or when they are not? The problem is that even this communication, which again, I said, has no binding effect, so doesn't require a lot of things, is blocked at political level. Another point I wanted to address is the law enforcement strategy in Europe to undermine the reputation of encryption and advocate for laws that would help them access encrypted data. In 2020 to 2022, there were a series of operations against encrypted communications network called SkyCC and EncroChat. Those were pitched as successful police operations to circumvent encryption. Obviously, there raise a lot of problems, which I don't have the time to go through. But what I wanted to address when raising those two operations were the underlying goals that they have, the political goals behind it. Yes, they were to mainly on the surface lead investigation into certain criminal networks, but also the political goal behind it were to delegitimize encrypted apps, trying to really frame them as because you're using them, you are by default a criminal, or you have something to hide. And so they were instilling a presumption of criminality. If you're using those type of encrypted apps, then you must be a criminal, or you must have done something wrong. And the second thing they tried to do with these operations and how they developed their narrative around it was to push for the principle that no communication or data must be beyond the effective reach of law enforcement or intelligence services. They really try to showcase that criminals are using encrypted networks, and therefore they're impeding the work of law enforcement to supposedly bring more security and justice in Europe, and therefore they shouldn't be the case. We shouldn't be able to accept that criminality is hiding behind encryption. And this was like kind of really, as I said, a narrative battle, a very good advocacy campaign by the law enforcement community, which was spearheaded by Europol, the European Police Cooperation Agency. I gave an example of an op-ed, which was co-authored by the executive director of Europol, Catherine DeBoll, and the district attorney of New York County, Cyrus R. Vance. And in there, you can really see this assumption, this tacit assumption that it is impossible for law enforcement to rely on the odds, on chance, They say criminal investigation now contain an element of chance, something that is unacceptable for law enforcement, for victims, and for society as a whole. And therefore, they must always have access to communications. They always have to have access to data, which means for encryption that they have to have guaranteed circumvention of encryption. What does that mean in practice? Because there is a problem, they can attack SkyCC and EncroChat because those are not really popular apps or only in for certain type of people. The problem comes with mainstream apps like Signal, WhatsApp, iMessage, and so on. The fact that end-to-end encryption is being rolled out in many digital services. What they're asking then is for backdoors, which they understand as the solution to guarantee constant access. And so here I have extracted a sequence from a documentary where Catherine Debol, again, the executive director of Europol, is really saying in front of camera that for her, it's fundamental that the law enforcement has encryption backdoors to access information. And this is kind of, as I said, a narrative that has been going on for some years. You have the joint declaration of European police chief who asked for backdoors last year. Europol also published a report on encryption, as well as Eurojust, which is the judicial cooperation agency, together with Europol, also repeated again that encryption is an issue and impede law enforcement access to data. These calls by law enforcement didn't go into deaf ears. The Commission is very keen on pursuing what the law enforcement authorities have been requesting, and therefore there is some elements in the mandate, the current mandate, that are related to access to encrypted data. This was done, there was some preparatory work that was done in the previous mandate, and that was carried out in the framework of the high-level group Access to Data for Effective Law Enforcement, also called Going Dark, the Going Dark problem. It was a working group set up by the Commission in June 2023, co-chaired by the Commission and the rotating EU Council presidency. But it was launched by the Swedish, basically. The Sweden as a member state is very keen on this issue. What was it? What was it like? It was composed of member states experts, mainly from prosecution offices, law enforcement authorities, and then there were a few observers from a data protection perspective, so a few from the data protection authorities, but they were really in a minority. They were not a typical high-level expert group. They were a high-level group, which meant that they didn't have to abide to certain transparency requirements in EU law, and therefore this process was rather opaque, and we as civil society had a hard time getting access to the discussions and what was debated among them. The mission is officially was officially for the group to make some recommendations for future development of EU union policies, which means that their ultimate goal is for the EU to take legislative action, such as what they did on the CSA regulation. And obviously, you wouldn't be surprised to see encryption backdoors as one of their main recommendations. They lay out their wishes for access to data by law enforcement, and one of them is implementing what they call lawful access by design. And so this would be a requirement for any type of data handlers, which is in the fourth box. The scope of intermediaries that we're talking about, it's telecom, email providers, social media, messenger services, smart and connected object manufacturers, and all type of hardware manufacturers, like all type of device, should have at the design stage taking into account the need for law enforcement to access data collected by their services or their product. which is basically implementing a backdoor at any level of the industry. They also talk about an obligation to decrypt in case those providers are encrypting data. They should always have in mind the possibility to decrypt it. And there are other obligations that they thought about related to data protection, but I think I will skip that for the sake of time. And so this high-level group, their recommendation actually fed into the Commission strategy for 2024-2029. And so on the 1st of April 2025, the Commission released its internal security strategy, which is called the Protect EU. And as you can see on the list, bullet point 3, the Commission is intending to present a technology roadmap on encryption to identify and assess technological solutions to enable lawful access to data by law enforcement authorities in 2026. Again, they're trying to map technological solutions such as client-side scanning, backdoors, any form of hacking or encryption workarounds into a document in order later to take legislative action and so put it into EU law. So this is very worrying, and this is going to be the main focus of digital rights activists in the coming years, because this is coming to something a bit more concrete than previous years where we had a lot of debates. Now we are really talking about having a roadmap of certain technology that allows the circumvention of encryption. And the Commission is leading that process. If you want to know more and to follow this, you're more than welcome to follow our website where we post regular updates and to subscribe to our newsletter for what's coming up. Any questions?
Thank you very much for this great talk, Chloé. And also, you seem to have a very beautiful cat that tries to make sure the abundance of cat videos stays on an all-time high on the internet. Any questions so far?
Thank you, Chloé. That was a very informative presentation. Learned quite a new things. I was wondering, this also sounds very scary, like mandatory, like backdoors. It sounds like a huge risk. How likely is it for this to become a reality? And I have a second question, which is, are there any other countries or outside the European Union who have done something similar? And if they have done something similar, has there been any pushback that was successful or not?
Thank you for the question. Should I answer directly or are we collecting questions?
You can.
I guess you can just answer directly.
Okay. And how likely is it to happen? The $1 million question or euro question? You can be a little bit sarcastic and ironic about it, because the Commission has been organizing debates around the encryption, as I said, since a long time, since over 20 years. And it never really materialized into concrete EU law, except the CSA regulation, which was the really first attempt to have in law an obligation for bypassing encryption. So this is well possible. Now they're at the stage of we're going to map what technology exists to achieve this. And this may well lead to a legislative proposal, which puts, again, on the industry, on the private sector, an obligation to use certain technologies and ensure lawful, quote unquote, access for law enforcement. So I would take it seriously, although you can be, again, sarcastic about it, because they've been running into the same debates over and over again. But since the CSA regulation has been adopted and proposed, I would take them very seriously in their attempt to legalize backdoors. As for the second part of your questions, I'm not aware of a lot of other attempts. I know that India also had attempts to introduce encryption backdoors, and I wouldn't be able to say if the civil society resistance there managed to push back against it. I also know that in the US there are recurring problems about telecom systems, the telecom infrastructure, which has known vulnerabilities open for a lot of time, and they are revealed when they are exploited by other states for geopolitical reasons. And so the recent scandals that you may have heard of is the Salt Typhoon hacking, which is a Chinese hacker group, which is close to the political power in China, who has been able to exploit certain vulnerabilities in the telecoms and access very important communications, including of public administrations. And as a result, when this was revealed in the press and to US administrations, the FBI even came out in the press recommending users to use encryption in order to protect themselves from this espionage, basically.
Wow, that's a sad story. Okay, next, please.
Thanks for your presentation. And I do a lot of assessments of big like cloud products and stuff like that. And encryption is often one of the most important security measures there. Also, when the services are used by governments. And do you see any debate going on the impact of backdoors for those usage scenarios? Because governments use like the same products as consumers. Is there any political debate like pointing that out, or is it still a hidden part of the hidden impact?
I would say it doesn't take the center stage of the debate, but it does come out, and we're always pointing at it as digital rights activists. We're like, but even your government officials are relying on those very important infrastructures. The reason why the CSA regulation, for example, has been blocked for so long is because at one point there is some member states' intelligence services which have pulled out the plug. They went to their ministries of interior and said, if you go forward with this plan, we are too going to be impacted, and our national security is going to be impacted too. So this is an aspect that sometimes is taken into consideration in some of the countries where people are basically connecting the dots, I would say. But it takes a long time before lawmakers realize that this is a crucial part or a crucial aspect of their plans. I had something else in mind, but now it's skipped out. It will come back later, maybe.
So we have another question.
Hello, Chloé. Thank you for the information. A lot of info. I apologize in advance if my question is a little long-winded, but I noticed, at least in the information you provided in your talk, that a lot of the debate and contested ideas in these law propositions seem to be all the way one way or all the way to the other, kind of saying, oh, we need to have access to all this unencrypted data before it gets encrypted, or no, you shouldn't, blah, blah, blah. To my mind, a few thoughts popped because where I'm from in Luxembourg, there's development for the past few years, and it's really ramping up now, of systems for financial detection of financial crimes, where it's like a section system where all of the banks tokenize the data to anonymize it, but maintain the important identifiable patterns and then send it off to the financial crimes sector of the intelligence, where they can use an algorithm to tell these crimes apart from normal law-abiding transactions. My question would be, why do you think there aren't, or at least to my knowledge, there isn't much development and interest in one of those two section systems for the CSA detection regulation? Because it seems that a system like that could be analogous to what they need for CSA, where you tokenize messages and try to maintain the ability to analyze and detect CSA in those messages while maintaining anonymity. Thank you for your talk.
Thank you for your question. I think the problem is ultimately that you need to re-identify the person at one point if you want to carry out the investigation up until the end. And therefore, your tokenization is applicable to until a certain point in the prosecutorial timeline. So it doesn't really matter. Like all the criticism that we have in the context of the CSA regulation would still apply, even if at the first stage of the flagging system, you're not identifiable. There are enough elements and personal identifiers that are retained later on, and that can be like, and then you can, like, basically you can then be re-anonymized, but it doesn't actually prevent false positive. You can still be reported to the police, although your content is legitimate. There's still this issue of mass surveillance, which happens in the financial sector, and this is actually one of the big loopholes that we have in financial transactions, or kind of a testing ground for a lot of mass surveillance measures in society. A lot of surveillance technologies are being tested, trained, developed, deployed for monitoring financial transactions. And this doesn't get as much resistance as private communications, although arguably it's equally sensitive. But I think for private communication, there is this additional element of sensitivity, I think. I don't want to make a hierarchy between the two content. I think it's equally sensitive, but I guess for private communications, they really directly attack core of the principle of privacy, professional secrecy, for example, and so on. So I don't think the anonymization technique would actually lift a lot of the doubts that were raised in the context of the CSA regulation.
So maybe we have a brief last question now.
Thank you very much for the interesting talk. I just had a quick question. In the UK, there's the Investigatory Powers Act, which allows the UK government to force vendors to implement backdoors. And this is what the UK government recently tried with Apple, to have them implement a backdoor. Apple, as a result, disabled end-to-end encryption on iCloud. What is your take on that law? And do you think there is any chance of pushback on this law?
Thank you. Very good question. Our network also includes a British organization, and obviously we've been very alert to the situation in the UK. We are obviously very concerned and opposing this type of laws. What the Investigatory Power Act is doing is basically putting in place a hacking system called key escrows. And key escrows are being debated since the 90s and have been proven to actually create vulnerabilities in systems that are putting everybody at risk, their privacy, the security. of systems, and obviously is something that needs to be fought against. And in the case of Apple, they had no other choice, but I think they also managed to make it public, which is also not a given, because this type of legislation also includes certain element of secrecy. So I think Apple was not even able legally to inform that they received such an order, but they did manage later on during the judicial proceedings. And I think this is part of a campaign to raise public awareness of the risk that this type of law enforcement powers have. Yes, so that's basically, yes, we are aware, yes, we are monitoring, and yes, we think it's a very dangerous practice that should be stopped. But that's, I think, part of the wider problem with the UK, who has very far-reaching powers in law for its intelligence services as well as its law enforcement agencies.
Thank you very much for that great talk and the detailed answers. Let's thank the speaker again, please. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Julia Angwin. She's an American investigative journalist, entrepreneur, and an author of best-selling books. And she's particularly interested in the impact that technology has on society, often pointing out the risk of big tech, of establishing dangerous structures. Julia has received many accolades. Among others, there's a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting as part of the Wall Street Journal stuff. And she's now presenting her latest insights on, and I would like to give the stage to Julia.
Hello, everybody. I hope you can hear me. Please, somebody let me know if you cannot. And I wish I could be there in person. I'm really thrilled, though, to be talking to you all about my favorite topic, which is surveillance and how we can live in a world of relentless surveillance. And particularly right at this moment, as we are seeing a rising tide of authoritarianism around the world, I want to talk a little bit about what that means for our relationship with surveillance and how we can try to counter it. So I'm going to start some slides now. And I'm hoping that everybody can see these. I'm assuming.
Yeah, that looks great.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so my talk is called Threat Modeling for Techno-Authoritarianism. So I'm assuming this crowd knows what I'm referring to when I talk about threat modeling, but I will also explain. So let me see if I can make the next slide. There we go. So I started thinking about threat modeling actually about 10 years ago when I wrote this book called Dragnet Nation. And at the time, I had been writing about surveillance and technology and how we were being tracked everywhere. And people thought I was a little crazy. And I was really focused, honestly, on the rise a lot of the commercial surveillance, right? The Googles, the Facebooks, all the people who are tracking our behavior online. And at the same time, Snowden had just revealed how much NSA was tracking everyone around the world. And so basically in my book, I explored the question of whether there was a way to get out of the dragnet. And what I mean by that is not to avoid surveillance if you're actually committing a crime and the police are after you, but more to get out of the fact that everyone's just being tracked regardless of whether they've done anything that requires them to be surveilled. And that's not to say I disagree with the techniques of surveilling criminals, but I just wanted to start with the premise that we shouldn't be surveilled if there isn't a reason, because that's how it used to be back in the days before electronic dragnets. So in the course of my book, I tried all sorts of techniques to avoid surveillance. And it was mostly, honestly, an exercise to try to show the reader that it was pretty impossible. But just for fun, some of you guys might be old hands and you might enjoy seeing some of the techniques that I was using back then because they're kind of adorable. I don't know if you all remember Text Secure. It was the predecessor to Signal. I was using something called a silent circle black phone, which some of you all might remember. But anyways, I used all of these different types of techniques to try to avoid the dragnet. And at the end of the book, I basically had spent thousands of dollars and so I concluded that privacy was sort of like a luxury good, but actually it was a fake luxury good because I didn't even get privacy, right? Like, in the reality is that the amount of data collection was sort of unavoidable if I wanted to participate in the modern world. So now, fast forward a decade, right? And a lot of what I was thinking about is worse, right? I was not envisioning what is called competitive authoritarianism, which is really the brand of authoritarianism that is arising around the world. So for those of you not steeped in this, competitive authoritarianism is a word, a phrase, an idea developed by a Yale, maybe Harvard professor, Stephen Levitsky, who basically said that right now the way authoritarianism is playing out is it looks a little bit like democracy. There's elections, but the incumbent basically abuses his state power, sometimes her, but mostly his state power, to deny the opposition adequate resources, right? I mean, the kind of most incredible example of this is Putin, right? I mean, there are elections in Russia, but like, you know, poisoning your opponents is like a pretty aggressive move for, you know, denying the opposition any adequate resources. So, but we're seeing obviously this across the board. Right now, we're seeing this in the United States in a really kind of dramatic way, right? Where Trump came in on a platform promising revenge against his political enemies and has been trying to exact it, right? And he is not necessarily always being successful, but he is mounting significant legal and financial burdens onto his political enemies in a way that we have never seen before. And so this actually makes it even more difficult to think about what to do with our privacy and how to protect ourselves, particularly when you have Doge. So Doge, as you probably all know, is this sort of quasi-agency, doesn't really actually have agency status, that Elon Musk set up and theoretically it was going to cut government waste. But as far as anyone can really tell, they haven't cut that much government waste, but they have assembled a huge amount of data. They've essentially gone in to different federal agencies, broken in and taken data, and they're assembling sort of a master database, the likes of which we've never seen, where all of the US government database, from your health records of the human services or the veterans records or your tax records, are all being sort of swept into this one big pile. And so I want to talk about what is the difference of a world where we're facing that kind of government surveillance versus the world I wrote about 10 years ago, where I was worried about all this new data that was being collected by the tech companies. And I was worried about the government getting that data. And to be clear, one of the things Snowden revealed was that the government was aggressively seeking that data from the tech companies. But we were not at that time in a world where the government itself was sweeping all this data together into a massive database. So I just want to talk briefly about what is the difference between these types of data. So when you look at commercial data, it's very much, I would say, in the category of intent data. It's what are you reading? Who are your friends? What are you buying? It's about it. It's essentially like your behavior. And a lot of that is used to infer intent. Are you likely to read more books like this that we can sell you? Are you, because of your friends, maybe you're likely to read more books like they read? It's not that it's not invasive, it's incredibly invasive. And this type of data has never been available before about so many people. But it is what I call soft data. It is squishy, right? They don't always know your name. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. But they don't know your income. There's a lot of things about you. They don't know exactly what car you drive. They guess based on what you're Googling. That is different than government data, right? The government has like real hard data on you. They have your income. They know what you spend. They know a lot about your health, mental health, medical. They know, I mean, the Treasury Department knows every single government payment that's going across the world, which Doge has sought access to. Defense Department has incredibly secure, sensitive data about security clearances. So there is a lot of information the government has. It's much more hard data, right? So it's like your bank account number, not just your spending habits. It's the amount of money in your bank account, as opposed to just generally how you prefer this thing over another thing, right? It's your actual debt, it's your drug use, it's your gambling, and these things are hard data. And what that means is it makes you more vulnerable, right? I mean, essentially, you're vulnerable to prosecution. You're vulnerable to like loss of your job or benefits. Unfortunately, these days we're seeing a lot of what they call deportation, but is actually rendition, because deportation involves due process and returning to your home country. You can lose rights to your children. Like, these are really significant consequences. Now, there are significant consequences too to the soft data. You can be branded a terrorist because you hang out with people online who look like that, or you can be price discriminated against. Sensitive information about yourself can be exposed. There are harms. They are more predictive harms. And so I think that it's worth just noting that we're in a world that is much more rife for really severe harms. This government data is essentially a honeypot for blackmail, fraud, sabotage, harassment, really significant national security risks. So, given all that, how bad is it? Essentially, what government data is at risk, right? Let's talk about that. And I am talking about the United States, so apologies. But I do believe that all of our pains and suffering will always seems to spread around the world. So hopefully this is helpful to you all too. One thing about the US, though, that is really worth talking about is we have a different approach to data than Europe. In the privacy debates of time, there's always this debate about whether to regulate collection or use of data. And the European approach has generally been more collection limitations, some use limitations for sure, but definitely more on the collection side. And the US, such as we have privacy regulations and data regulations, which by the way, we don't have that much, they're much more along the lines of use. So, we don't have a comprehensive privacy law. We don't have a data protection authority. We only have some use restrictions basically in certain sectors. Whereas in Europe, there's just much more comprehensive data protection laws and authorities, and baseline levels of, privacy that you can count on. I want to talk a little bit about the history. So the US approach to privacy of federal government data goes back to sort of the Watergate era. So this is a front page of the 1968 New York Times. So you can see that there's still, this is like Vietnam is big, right? We're really in a time of turmoil in the United States. And the very bottom of the page, you can see there's this little story, data bank, peril or aid. This is essentially the Johnson administration here. So I don't know if you can really read it, but the Johnson administration was proposing a national data bank that would put all of the federal government data together into one big pile. And I don't know if you can read it, but it's a pretty great lead. It says, do you drink heavily at home? Have you been married more than twice? Are your sexual preferences exotic? How are you and your wife getting along? All these questions are of interest to numerous government agencies, and the answers, or what purports to be the truth about millions of Americans in these intimate matters, are tucked away in official Washington dossiers. And this article really expressed sort of, and this is the second page, which I had to show you because I was just so delighted to find it in the archives, really was an example of the public outcry about this plan. And I just love this quote from Vance Packard, right, which is still true to this day, right? The possibility of redemption is likely to be incomprehensible to a computer. And that really speaks to, I think, the real peril of data collection in general, which is that it closes off the possibility, identifying people and categorizing them based on past behavior closes the opportunities for change and growth, right? So yeah, maybe we all did something bad in the past, but we're going to become better people. We're on a journey to every day is a new day. And the sort of centralization of all this data and the deterministic nature of it was so threatening that actually the public did rise up and say, no, we don't want this. And the US passed the Privacy Act of 1974. And it basically said, look, you can't put all this data together in one big pile. It said you can't, if the data was collected from one reason, you can't use it for another reason without basically giving some sort of public notice. So now this public notice is not awesome. It's a publish of a little notice in the Federal Register, which no one reads, but it does at least require notice, and it does give individuals the right to request their own data and to correct it if it's wrong. So essentially, this is the US approach to limiting government surveillance of its own citizens has been to silo the data. It's to put, each agency has it, but they can't share it. And that is constantly challenged, right? So I'm sure you may all remember in 2002 when the Defense Department said, oh, we're gonna put it all together and analyze it in the Total Information Awareness Project. That was killed. The Senate was like, nope, everybody freaked out. That was right after 9/11. They were like, we're gonna solve this by putting all the data together. No. The public said, no, we're not gonna break those silos, right? But they have been chipped away at. In 2012, I wrote this story for the Wall Street Journal about the National Counterterrorism Center. They wanted access to all this data from the Department of Homeland Security. They wanted flight records. They wanted people hosting foreign exchange students, casino employees. And the Department of Homeland Security actually fought against the program, but the Counterterrorism Center won the right to get that data. And they did one of these Federal Register notices, like, we're going to use it, blah, 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 you know, if you want to object. And people did object, but they still did it anyways. So the silos aren't perfect, right? They can be broken, but it did require, like this story, it did require a fight inside the White House Situation Room between two agencies, right? And so at least that it was hard. It was like hard to do. Now we're in an era where it's just lawless, right? So basically DOJ came in and the staff went to each and every agency and sought root access to their systems, right? Social Security records, Treasury payment systems, tax returns. I mean, everything there. They didn't even do the fig leaf of the Federal Register notices. They didn't have any fights in the White House Situation Room. They just went and did it. And it is probably illegal, right? There are more than 30 lawsuits filed alleging violations of the Federal Privacy Act, but they're doing it and the courts are slow, right? So right now what we have is a lot of stories about how they're building a master database and they're going to put all this data together and use it to track down immigrants, which, you know, is the classic way these things start. We're going to track down bad people. I mean, I don't know why we've decided immigrant stands for bad people. It used to be terrorists, but the bar is lower, I guess, now. Anyways, the point is that you know that these databases will be used against everyone eventually. They always start off as, we're just focused on this one threat. Now, there's some pretty terrifying reports out there that I don't know whether people have been following. So I just want to remind you of kind of some of the information that has come forward, right? There's a whistleblower has come to the Democrats in the Congressional Oversight Committee and said, DOJ engineers are seeking and getting full access to networks, databases across different agencies. They are loading that data onto individual laptops that they keep in backpacks full of laptops, each with access to different systems. I mean, this is a cybersecurity nightmare, to be honest. There's this whistleblower who you may or not have heard of, but you should, Daniel Baroulis, very brave, came forward from the National Relations Board, Labor Relations Board. He basically said, he was in IT. He said, they came in, they told him that the Doge employees had to have accounts. There could be no logs or records of those accounts. They had to have unrestricted access to the systems to read, copy, alter data. And then when he noticed suspicious activity of data exfiltration, he was told not to create an official report to the Cybersecurity Administration. This is his chart that he showed of the data exfiltration as there was traffic leaving the NLRB system. And just to be clear, the NLRB is pretty sensitive data, right? These are labor relations disputes between employees and the companies they work for. It can often involve trade secrets and actual individual information about the employees and how they, like, actual allegations with people's names. It is not data that anyone wants to see out there. But at the same time, there's been a legal breakdown of the silos. So even when there's technical breakdowns, right, where they're just going in and taking the data, also some of these agencies are making deals. So the IRS, you know, the top officials actually resigned because they were being asked to sign a deal to give data about from tax returns to the ICE Border Patrol. And they basically, there's one of the most sacred silos of federal government data is the tax return data. And many undocumented immigrants file taxes in order to prove that they're part of the society, building their track record to become legal migrants. And the idea that that would be then used against them to track them down is so shocking that the top officials at the IRS actually resigned in protest of this memo. But this memo was signed between the IRS and DHS saying they would give this information to the FBI or to ICE. So the silos are breaking down. The courts are trying to, but it takes months, right? There are more than 30 lawsuits against Doge. So far, there's been, I think, limits placed only in these 2 cases. There's many cases pending. Treasury, though, the Privacy Act doesn't really have a lot of penalties in it. It more has remediation. So essentially, once Doge promised to go through some training about what are the security protocols around accessing the data, they were given access to it after months of court battles. Right now, there's a temporary restraining order on access to the Social Security data, but we don't know yet whether that will end the same way as Treasury. The Times did a list of 314 pieces of data that Doge may have, or actually most likely has, and this is the bare minimum of what they actually have. And I just put up an example of the list here because it's just insane, right? Your farm profits, your bank information, your birth certificate, your email address, your taxpayer ID number, your marriage certificate, your password to the US government websites. It's an insane amount of information. So what do we need to make this better? Well, at the very least, we need some better laws, right? The US needs to catch up and have a comprehensive federal privacy law. Right now, there's at least an effort in the Senate to modernize the Federal Privacy Act of 1974 to envision the type of threat that it's facing right now. That's the bare minimum. And by the way, that bill's going nowhere. And then we also need better law enforcement. Right now, we don't have a data privacy authority that polices this type of thing. The Federal Trade Commission, which essentially is that in the US, Trump fired the 2 Democratic commissioners who are suing, saying that their firing was illegal. But that agency is not even staffed, right? So it's not even enforcing. It's not being staffed in the sense it doesn't have the Democratic commissioners, so it's been crippled. And so we just need both better laws and better law enforcement. But I think that we need to also step back and say that we need something more, which is we need to fight authoritarianism. And that requires a lot more. That requires solidarity. That requires non-cooperation. And what do I mean by that? The way you combat authoritarianism is by standing together. You know, the people who have protested against Tesla have brought its stock down by 30% in the past 6 months. That's impressive work. And that is actually really brings significant consequences to the actors. And non-cooperation is don't comply with these requests. Like the Trump's request to all these law firms to give him free work and to comply with his extreme requests about them not taking political positions against him, that is, the law firms that have fought it have been successful in court. Perkins Coie has led that charge. And that type of non-cooperation with a wannabe authoritarianism is what prevents them from gaining full control. I wrote a piece about this recently, How to Be a Dissident, A Guide to Courage in Trump's Age of Fear. I'm working on turning that into a book, so this is just a little self-promotion for that book that will be coming out hopefully next year. But I think it's really important. Like, the reality is, in my book, Dragnet Nation, I tried to take all these individual actions to protect my privacy. And even in that time, which was not an authoritarian time, it wasn't enough. Collective action is the only thing that saves us. And we need that even more in an era of authoritarianism. So I just have to say, the price of liberty is eternal vigilance. We cannot let these governments do what they want. We're the citizens, they work for us. And so I want to just leave you with that and open it up to any questions.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this great talk. So, please, questions. Over there.
Oh, thank you. Hey, thank you for the great talk. So I'm a bit like the conclusion that we have to get together and to protect our privacy is not something I really like as a conclusion, since this is technology that allows us to have better lives. Do you think that technology can also play a role into helping us to have more privacy in the same time? I mean, maybe the systems that we have in production and the government uses are just not like they don't protect our privacy enough. Do you see any solution in that direction also?
I think you're asking whether there's like a technological solution to this as opposed to a sociological. And I do think obviously technology can play a role. I mean, one of the most important technologies right now in the world is Signal, I think, the encrypted messaging program that is the way that we can make sure that the government's not listening to us and not collecting information about who we talk to. And it's probably the best encrypted program we have. And so I think that plays a huge role. And I think technology in general, like encryption and security, is a huge piece of protecting our data. But if you talk to any security professional, they'll tell you that the vulnerabilities are always human, right? You can put as much technology as you want, but in the end, there's some human who falls for a phishing scam or something. And so there's always going to be the human element. And I guess when I'm talking about the US specifically, I mean, this may or may not be as true in Europe, where you have, I think, a more trusting relationship with your government, and probably for better, for good reasons. But in a situation where we don't trust our government, and the only way to really force them not to abuse the data they already have, right? The cat's out of the bag. We can't technologically protect it now that it's in the hands of Doge. So we have to protect it other ways. And the only way to do that, honestly, is to, as citizens, rise up together and demand better behavior.
Hello, Julia. Thank you for the depressing talk for the
sorry.
future. No, it's great. I'm sure most people in the room already shared a lot of the views for the future. But from my understanding of your talk and what I see in the news as well, obviously, a lot of the erosion to privacy and personal rights to privacy, especially in the US, have so far been thinly veiled under national security, generally nationalist talking points and stuff like that, which can be effective at hiding the true purpose of taking away privacy. But when do you, probably yes, but when do you see this process going beyond that excuse and starting to, for example, prosecute companies or people that provide privacy services, such as you said, Signal, or arguably like the people that handle things like VPNs, the Tor network, all that stuff. When do you see that step being taken where the excuse and the mask is off and they're just like, yeah, no, we want to see everything and prosecute those?
I have to say, I mean, despite the depressingness of my talk, I am a little bit of a like congenital optimist. And so I do see some hope in the fact that everyone in the Trump administration is using Signal and, mistakenly adding journalists to their Signal chats, but they're using this stuff too, right? And so I also think that Doge is a massive cybersecurity risk. Like, I just don't, it's not even a thought. Like, this is a fact, right? The way that this data is being exfiltrated is absolutely a national security risk. And so I see this rare moment where maybe our national security concerns could actually finally not be in tension with privacy concerns. And we could unite these two strands and say, look, for national security reasons, we have to protect our data, right? I think this is particularly exciting opportunity now that Musk is out of the government and fighting with Donald Trump, as you may have all seen all day yesterday on social media. Maybe there's a moment where we can turn this around and say, this guy ran off with all this data. First of all, we need to get it back. And secondly, we need to protect it better. And so I realize that it's a naive and optimistic viewpoint, but I do want to believe that there's an opportunity here. That said, I think you're completely right that all of these providers of secure information, Proton, Tor, Signal, are, I'm sure, bracing for an attack. And I hope and pray that that doesn't come through and that there's people rally to defend them. But once again, I do think that the answer here is solidarity and not legal battles can be won and lost, but the law generally follows the public, and the public has to demand that they want these things, And so I do think that's one reason to use these services is to vote with your feet, like to show the support through that and also donate to them.
Hi, Julia. Nice to see you again. I have, I guess, two questions. The first is maybe too dark. I'll ask it next, actually. But the second question is, can you think of historical examples where things sort of head in the direction that they're heading and that it is resolved peacefully through civil disobedience rather than the American historical trend of civil war? And my second question is, what's your exit plan? Since you're obviously on the list of people that are worth rounding up because of the impactful work you do, and I'm a big fan, obviously.
Thank you.
And I'm just wondering, because it seems like, outside, it looks like 1930s Germany in America. And I was born in America, and now I live in Germany. So I'm saying that with some reflection that you should really have an exit plan. Thanks for your talk. Great talk.
Thank you. Well, I'm a real believer in nonviolent resistance. I think the data is very clear that it is more effective. If any of you are not familiar with it, Erica Chenoweth's work at Harvard, she has been cataloging every action against a totalitarian regime for 100 years. And nonviolent resistance is twice as effective as violent resistance. And also, her data shows that if you have 3.5% of the population mobilized, you can be effective. In fact, very few regimes have withstood that amount of people mobilizing. And so that is an achievable number. I think that, and so I believe in that. That's why I'm writing a book on how to be a dissident, and it's going to be about a nonviolent approach. And I really want to promote that because I think that's our only way out. Her data also shows that when you have what America is in called democratic backsliding, that it takes about 10 years to get out of it. Now, you know, my question is, when did we really start democratic backsliding? I feel like we could date it at least back 10 years, maybe longer. So, so maybe we're near the end. Maybe we can turn it around. But I do think that there's a that we just have to be in it for a long fight, and I guess that's what I want to do. And I don't really have an exit plan. I really want to I'm just going to go down fighting over here. You know, that's my plan.
Another question? So then maybe I do have one question. So, well, typically these developments go hand in hand with increasing divisiveness in the society, kind of counteracting your point of solidarity. And very often, like there was like historically, governments have maybe paid spies or blackmailed them to spy on their neighbors. Now, this is seemingly still not present. But do you see like kind of any formal incentives for people to comply with the government? So kind of to have maybe a point system as other countries, or any advantages by complying what the government wants?
I think I maybe need just like a one sentence more to understand the question.
Yeah, should I repeat it, or?
Yeah, just sort of. Are you asking whether the government can give incentives for compliance, or if the government can give incentives for people to spy on each other?
Yeah, kind of. So like
or both.
to create some divisiveness in the society, you could kind of like maybe in some way or the other pay people or give some advantages to people that comply with the absurd requirements that governments have. Do you see something on the horizon here as well?
I mean, this is a very common tactic of authoritarian regimes, is to basically reward people who comply and to punish people who do not comply. And it's already happening, right? I mean, there's actually a law in Texas, right, where you can get a bounty payment if you turn in a woman who's trying to get an abortion. So I think there's similar things about helping with rounding up immigrants. So we are already in that world where the government is offering those things. And then, of course, at a larger level, right, Trump is being very clear about, you know, what some people have called like the coin-operated government, which is basically, if you give him a plane, he'll be nice to you, and if you don't, he won't, right? I mean, that's the prosecution of the law firms, was essentially to get free work from them and to require them to not represent his enemies. And so so we're already in that world. That is the authoritarian playbook that he is working by, and that's why non-cooperation is such an important part of nonviolent resistance, because we cannot comply. Because eventually, right, of course, it will be much more dire consequences, like you're going to prison if you don't comply. Right now, you can still fight in court, and so we have to take that opportunity while we have it. I'm sorry to say this is just a really dark conversation, but I'm trying to figure out a way to end it positively.
But thanks anyway. I guess this is a genuine your genuine take, anyways. So, any other question? Last one, maybe.
So I wanted to follow up and just clarify. I wasn't advocating violence. I wanted to denote the idea that the state is violent inherently in what it's doing. And there's a question in which they escalate that violence to the point that it's beyond, right? Many people are actually being taken away without due process, and they're not going to courts. Today, I watched a video of a woman being taken from a court in Seattle, armed men in masks, only one badge visible, but you couldn't tell the difference between this and any other kidnapping. And I'm not advocating for violence, although it is extremely effective. It's not effective against states usually in any case, and it's obviously often not moral. But will you be taking feedback from, say, hypothetical dissidents for your book? Are you interviewing people like Ed Snowden, for example? Is that the thing you'll be doing?
Yeah, we're talking to dissidents around the world who have fought authoritarian regimes. And yeah, I mean, I'd love to talk to Ed. I've always wanted to talk to him. But I would, I guess I did interview him once. But yeah, that's the point of the book, is to take lessons from dissidents around the world who can tell us their learnings, and also to highlight the brave people in the United States who are already stepping up. I have been incredibly impressed by some of the really local actions. I'm sure you may have seen the video recently of San Diego neighbors driving ICE out of their neighborhood. These guys were dressed like for, you know, a Fallujah invasion and tactical weapons and masks and huge guns, and a bunch of like moms and dads from the neighborhood just like forced them out by embarrassment and filming them and singing and chanting at them. And so I want also to highlight what is happening here in the United States, because the media is not great at telling those stories, and those stories are really important because it shows people that they can, it's achievable. We can do this. We have to do it together. And I understand your point about violence. The state is violent. The reason nonviolence works is it actually shows people how asymmetric that violence is and makes them morally outraged and willing to join the side that's fighting against the unjustness of the violence. So I think we're aligned on that.
Yeah, absolutely. Great talk. Thank you again.
Thank you.
So there's a last question. Maybe if it's really brief, then.
Yes, hi. Thanks for your talk. I had two questions, but for the sake of time, I will ask the shorter one. I agree with you that I think the solution to this problem in general is going to be social and increasing solidarity, but I'm wondering what your view is from the US perspective regarding the mechanism for developing this solidarity. So just to give context, I mean, today in the Netherlands, there was a train strike and, well, like labor unions in the US barely have this kind of success level in their activity. So I'm just wondering, like, do you see this kind of solidarity coming from a labor angle or from some other angle? Like maybe as a way to end on a positive note, like where do you see the solidarity coming from is the question.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right. We have some real disadvantages here with labor being hollowed out. Another huge disadvantage we have, by the way, is that our federal capital is not a state, and so can easily be taken over by martial law. And there are a lot of people who expect that to happen, you know, any day now. And so, and that is often, you know, where real change happens is when a leader, you know, this is happening in Serbia, it's happening in Turkey, right, where a leader has, you know, the whole population at his doorstep in the capital is often often the culmination of these types of protests against authoritarians. But you are right to say that economic boycotts, withdrawal of workforce is one of the most effective ways to counter an authoritarian. So basically economic strikes like Poland Solidarity, where they were turning on and off general strikes at the drop of a hat to make demands, and then when they weren't met, they would turn it off, and then if they weren't met, they would turn it back on. And that's considered like the gold standard. I think also the boycotts in South Africa against apartheid. A lot of people think about the West's boycott of investment in South Africa as the factor that did it, but actually there were a lot of boycotts within South Africa where the Black population stopped buying at any white stores. And those types of economic behaviors often are very effective. And street protest is actually not always the most effective. It's like a frosting on the cake for a lot of these types of movements. But what it does is creates a belief structure for other people to understand, a permission structure that there are others with them and that they can also participate. And so I think what's happening right now is a lot of in the US, a lot of this is happening very locally, right? Like basically communities are just getting super mad about people getting kidnapped off the streets in their communities, and they're stepping up. And the Tesla boycotts were actually incredibly effective as an economic boycott. And so I think the US in our usual way is going to do things a little differently because we don't have some of these structures like unions that necessarily shepherd this work. But I have been heartened by the fact that people are getting together and doing this. And this is why I'm writing a book about it, because I want to invite people to do more of it.
Thank you very much for this great talk again, Julia. Let's thank the speaker again, please.
Thank you all. It's been such a joy. I wish I could have been there.